Let's return now to Marx's microtheory and say something about what's most problematic with it. We saw that Marx's microtheory is based on the labor theory of value. So I'm going to revisit Marx's assumptions about a particular notion here, namely that of living human labor, and then discuss the moral argument behind the labor theory of value. When Marx defends the labor theory of value, he insists that living human labor power is the only thing that creates fresh surplus value. One difficulty with this proposal is that it ignores the contribution of dead workers. So Marx counts the contribution of living workers, but what about the workers who made technological developments possible that help increase capitalist production? Aren't these being exploited either indirectly by the capitalist or by the living workers themselves? So if you take seriously this project of trying to define objectively the rate of exploitation that Marx has, you can wonder why does the contribution of dead workers is not taken into account. Moreover, and perhaps a bit more importantly, is that Marx's way of defining exploitation does not take into account the contribution of the capitalist herself. Why isn't it the case that the labor that the capitalist performs shouldn't go in the creation of the surplus value? Now, you might think that it makes sense for the historical context in which Marx was writing in the 19th century, where you're running factories, so the type of intellectual work that a capitalist might put in didn't seem to matter. But when we think about the role of entrepreneurial ideas in the creation of productive systems, it seems rather absurd to say that the work of the capitalist doesn't contribute anything to the value of what's produced. But if you would admit to that, you get into the problem of how do you tell them apart? How do you distinguish the work of the worker and how that creates surplus value and how the work of the capitalist creates surplus value? Then you can also ask, look, the worker in the Marxian story also has typically a spouse at home feeding him, making his sandwiches as he goes to the factory and so on. What about the spouse at home? Why isn't she exploited indirectly or directly by the capitalist or by the worker himself? And if we go down that route, we can also ask, what about the others who contribute to the productivity of the process, either directly or indirectly? What about the school teacher that drummed the work ethic into the worker? Didn't that school teacher contribute something to the productivity of the worker? So to the creation of surplus value? So you're going to get this huge web of entangled entitlements if you're trying to trace out who contributed what work to the creation of something of value. So the basic problem is that Marx's focus on living human labor power and as a source of fresh exchange value and a source of surplus value ignores many types of contributions, work contributions to this surplus value, the dead workers, of capitalists, of the support network of the worker. And if one tries to add these contributions, the calculations of how each of them contributes to the creation of surplus value becomes unmanageable. We can even dig further into this assumption that making something, working, creates entitlements. After all, this is what gives Marx's theory in a way its normative edge, is the claim that workers produce something for which they are not compensated. They produce something and the capitalist takes it. That's the claim. we said that what differentiates labor power from all other commodities is that it's necessary for the production of all the other commodities, is the common denominator. So remember the example, if I have a certain amount of money and I spend it on a meal and wine, I consume the meal and then that money is gone. Or whereas if I spend it on paying for someone to paint a wall in my house, then it's doesn't completely disappear. It creates fresh value because my house is going to be worth more if I'm trying to sell it. But something seems to be wrong with this argument. It seems wrong to say that if I consume the food, what I invested in it just goes. Because after all, I have more calories of energy, which I could use to paint my own house. Of course, I could decide to sit on the couch and pay someone else, but it's my decision. I can use the energy to paint the house. So this Marxian assumption that there is something special about labor power as a commodity can be challenged. An interesting Cambridge economist called Piero Safra wrote a book called The Production of Commodities. In this book he said, imagine an economy that has three commodities: corn, books, and labor. Corn is food. It's true that it takes labor to produce corn and to produce books. And it's true that it doesn't take books to produce corn or labor, but it's not true that it doesn't require corn to produce labor and books. So corn or food or anything that's necessary for the production of labor power is going to have the same property as labor power itself. It's going to be present necessarily. It's going to be the common denominator. And so, Safra said, based on this idea, you can do a corn theory of value for this economy that will have exactly the same mathematical properties as the labor theory of value. And then you can have your theory of the exploitation of corn by capital, the rate of exploitation of corn by capital. That will be exactly the same to the rate of exploitation of labor by capital. There's no difference mathematically speaking. Why is this argument interesting? It's interesting because it shows that whatever Marx says about exploitation being merely a technical notion, it's not. It's a moral idea. We talk about exploitation of natural resources, but we don't say that the corn owns what was produced with the corn. We don't say that corn was exploited in the way that worker was exploited. So the idea of exploitation is tied to the workmanship idea. That's why, even if you reject the labor theory of value, you're still left with this intuition that there is something to workmanship. There's something of value in work. So most people won't want to get rid of this intuition. So if I write a book, I say something like, I put all this work into the book. It's mine. It's my work. Somebody takes it, you're going to have the intuition of saying, you stole it, you've taken something from me. Now, not everybody accepts this idea, this very conception that we own what we make. Robert Nozick, he tries to make fun of this labor theory of value by proposing the following sort of thought experiment. He asks, why does mixing one's labor with something make one the owner of it? Perhaps because one owns one's labor, so it's like self-ownership. And so one comes to own a previously unowned thing that becomes permeated with what one owns. Ownership seeps over into the rest. But why isn't mixing what I own with what I don't own a way of losing what I own rather than a way of gaining what I don't? If I own a can of tomato juice and spill it into the sea so that its molecules mingle throughout the sea, do I thereby come to own the sea? Or have I foolishly dissipated my tomato juice? So the question that's raised by this normative idea of workmanship is, why do you want to say, when I put effort and energy into something, that something is mine? This seems like a very perplexing idea, but that's something that doesn't go away despite the criticism that one can raise against the labor theory of value. So if both Marx's micro and macro theory of capitalism are problematic, what's left? I think there are really two main things that can constitute Marx's legacy. One is a negative argument that comes out of the Marxist criticism of capitalist system, and one is a positive argument about freedom. Let's start with the negative argument. The negative argument is what remains even if Marx's theory of exploitation can be shown to be deeply problematic. Because the problems with Marx's view of exploitation doesn't mean that Marx doesn't have a good criticism of the markets as distributors of either good or harms in a society. Marx's criticism of the markets shows that markets reflect the inequalities that come into them, but they don't give any account of the justice of those inequalities. So there's a problem, if you like, of the tyranny of the status quo. The market systems are biased towards the status quo, but market principles are purely technical principles. They tell you nothing about how you got to the status quo, and there's a kind of garbage in, garbage out problem with market system. So there's a kind of unfinished agenda that's put on the table by the Marxian critique of markets, even though Marx's own answer or own positive theory doesn't work. Markets being biased towards the status quo is related to the fact that markets, by themselves, thinking of markets and the principles that govern them, doesn't provide you an explanation of the source of injustice in a society. The second legacy of Marxism is not an argument about the source of value. So we saw that there are many ways to criticize the labor theory of value. But the labor theory of value, especially if one digs into its normative basis, reveals an argument about freedom. Remember that we said at the beginning of the lectures about Marx that Marx is often viewed as an egalitarian. But I also said that that's a misconception, that he's better viewed as a theorist of freedom. His ideal was a world in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, where our labor is not alienated. So his version of the communist society is unsustainable, but it still has as its basis this argument about the importance of freedom being the basic value. Even Marx's definition of class, when you think about it, is really an argument about freedom. When he says that you are working class if you have to sell your labor power to somebody else in order to live, it's the compulsion that he wants to emphasize. It's not whether you choose to sell your labor power. So for instance, in my case, I like lecturing, have a captive audience of people who have to listen to me. It makes me feel good, but that's not what makes me working class. It's that I have to work for somebody else in order to survive. It's that element of compulsion and that lack of freedom that kind of defines what is working class. So, the argument about freedom is related to this idea that there is a class monopoly of the means of production, which creates power. Some people have power to insist that other people work for them. So it's really not about any sort of calculus of contributions and who puts what into what and how surplus value is created, and whether the rate of exploitation is 1.5 or 2.3. It's really about the distribution of power in the production process. So if you're going to take anything from Marx that's of enduring value, it's going to be this argument about power. It's going to be an argument which says that a world in which we organize things so that one class effectively has power to control a different class's behavior, that is an unjust world. Much of the neo-Marxist literature that people take seriously gives up on the labor theory of value. And we saw the many problems with it. But it explores this power-based argument as the root of what it was Marx was trying to get to with his concept of exploitation.